The charging station was at 0%. Someone had been there first and someone else had decided that didn't matter. Nolan Price had built his entire morning around 17 minutes. That was how long it took the Level 2 charger in Slot C of the Cedarwood Point HOA parking structure to push enough juice into his 2023 Ioniq 5 to get him through his commute, his afternoon site visits, and the return trip home without anxiety. He had reserved that slot through the community app at 5:47 the night before. He had the confirmation screenshot. He had a contract, essentially, with the 72 homeowners who had all signed the same community agreement when they moved in. Slot C was his until 7:15 a.m. He discovered the violation at 6:38. His charger cable, his personal Level 2 cable, which he had purchased for $260 and kept coiled in the back of the Ioniq, had been unplugged from his car and set on the concrete floor like a garden hose someone had tossed aside. In its place, a pearl-white Mercedes EQS sat connected, humming softly, drawing power from the shared community outlet that Nolan's HOA dues helped maintain. The Mercedes belonged to Renata Good. Nolan knew this because her personalized plate read RNTA1, and because Renata Good had made herself impossible to forget in the 14 months he had lived at Cedarwood Point. She was the HOA board's self-appointed conscience. She had voted against the EV charging expansion project 3 years before Nolan arrived, then purchased an electric vehicle herself, and petitioned to have 2 dedicated slots installed near the elevator, the most convenient spots in the structure. She had circulated a memo about parking etiquette last spring that contained 11 bullet points, 6 of which applied exclusively to behaviors she personally disliked. She had filed a noise complaint against Nolan's upstairs neighbor for running a dishwasher at 10 p.m. She was, in the truest and most exhausting sense of the word, a presence. Nolan stood in the parking structure for a moment, his laptop bag on his shoulder, his travel mug still warm in his hand, and looked at the pearl-white Mercedes. The charging indicator on its dashboard pulsed a slow, satisfied green. He looked at his own car, sitting dark and depleted at 11% battery, which would get him to work and approximately nowhere else. He looked at his cable on the floor. He took a photograph, then he took 4 more from different angles. He did not unplug Renata's car. He considered it. The thought moved through him with a kind of electric clarity, the simplicity of returning what had been done to him, but he let it pass. He had learned over 34 years that the cleanest moves were the ones made on record. He opened the Cedarwood Point community app, navigated to the dispute resolution portal, and filed a formal complaint with timestamps, photographs, and his original reservation confirmation attached. He rated the severity as high. In the notes field, he wrote, "Personal charging equipment removed from reserved slot and replaced by non-reserving vehicle. Evidence attached. Requesting board review and documentation of incident for insurance purposes." That last phrase, insurance purposes, was deliberate. He called a rideshare, got to work 40 minutes late, and spent his lunch break on the phone with his insurance provider, then with an attorney he had used once before for a landlord dispute. The attorney, a compact and precise woman named Sylvia Acaffer, listened to his account without interruption. When he finished, she asked him 3 questions. Did you have a documented reservation? Yes. Was your personal property, the cable, moved without your consent? Yes. Do you have photographic evidence of both the displacement of your property and the vehicle that replaced yours? Yes. Okay, Sylvia said. A few different angles here. Conversion of personal property depending on your state, negligence if the cable was damaged. The HOA itself may have liability if they failed to enforce their own reservation policy. What's the value of the cable? $260. The cable alone isn't worth litigating. But if you want to put pressure on the HOA to enforce their own rules and create a paper trail that costs this woman something, time, attention, inconvenience, we can do that very efficiently. Nolan told her to proceed efficiently. What neither Nolan nor Sylvia knew yet, what would take another 4 days to surface, was that Renata Good had done this before, not to Nolan, to 3 other residents over the prior 18 months, all of whom had submitted complaints that had been quietly archived without response. 2 of those residents had since moved out of Cedarwood Point. The third, a software engineer named Deshaun Mercer in Unit 14, had saved every complaint, every non-response, and every photograph. He had been waiting with the particular patience of someone who understood that systems eventually generate the conditions for their own correction, for a moment like this one. Deshaun reached out to Nolan on the community app the afternoon of the incident. His message was 3 sentences. "I saw your complaint. I have documentation of 2 prior identical incidents involving the same vehicle. Call me." They met that evening at the small table near the mailboxes in the lobby. Deshaun spread his documents, printed, organized, dated, across the table with the calm of someone presenting a quarterly report. There were 9 photographs, 3 complaint submissions with their HOA case numbers, and a printed copy of the community's EV charging policy, sections 4.2 through 4.7 highlighted in yellow. Nolan read through everything without speaking. When he finished, he looked up. "She unplugged Marcus Tran in October," Deshan said. "She unplugged a woman named Petra Voss in February. Both filed complaints. The board acknowledged receipt and did nothing." "Who's on the board?" "Renata Good is the vice president." The silence between them was the particular kind that forms when a thing that should be surprising turns out to be completely predictable. "She's been self-policing the dispute process," Nolan said, "for at least 2 years based on what I could find." Nolan contacted Sylvia Okafor again that night. He forwarded Deshan's documents. Sylvia's response came at 11:23 p.m., which told him she had looked at them immediately. The email was 4 paragraphs. The relevant portion was the second. Given the pattern of behavior, the board's documented failure to enforce its own policy, and the vice president's apparent conflict of interest in adjudicating complaints filed against herself, there were grounds for a claim against the HOA under California's Davis-Sterling Act, which governed community associations and included specific provisions about selective enforcement and fiduciary duty. The potential exposure for the HOA was not trivial. If Nolan could establish that the board had knowingly ignored complaints to protect a board member, they were looking at legal fees, potential punitive damages, and mandatory policy reform. The number Sylvia put at the top of the potential range was $10,000. Nolan read that figure twice. He had not come to this situation looking for money. He had come to it because someone had pulled a cable out of his car and left it on a concrete floor and thought there would be no consequence. He sat with the number for a while, then he replied to Sylvia's email with 2 words: "Move forward." The formal legal notice went to the HOA board the following Thursday. It was addressed to all 5 members individually and to the association as a body. It cited the 3 documented incidents, the board's failure to respond to any of them, and Renata Good's dual role as the subject of complaints and a decision-making member of the body responsible for adjudicating those complaints. It requested production of all complaint records from the prior 3 years and gave the board 14 days to respond before a formal filing. Nolan did not tell Renata this was coming. He had no obligation to, but he did something that would matter later. He forwarded the legal notice to every member of the Cedarwood Point community listserv, with a cover note that was factual, measured, and absolutely devastating in its specificity. He listed the dates of the 3 incidents. He included the case numbers of the unresolved complaints. He noted that the vice president of the board had been the subject of all 3 complaints. He did not use words like corrupt or malicious or unfair. He did not need to. The facts were a complete sentence. By 9 p.m. that evening, 41 residents had replied to the listserv thread. 37 of them were expressing some version of the same thing. They had noticed irregularities in board enforcement for a long time, and they had assumed nothing could be done. Renata Good had assumed the same thing. She was about to discover how precisely wrong that assumption was. She called Nolan at 8:47 the following morning. He let it go to voicemail. She called again at 9:15. He let that go too. He listened to both messages. In the first, she described the legal notice as an overreaction and suggested they discuss the situation as neighbors. In the second, her tone had shifted into something tighter, not quite an apology, but the verbal territory adjacent to one. She used the phrase mutual resolution twice and mentioned that she had simply not realized his car was reserved in that slot. Nolan forwarded both voicemails to Sylvia Okafor with the note, "She's making contact, what do I do?" Sylvia's response was immediate, "Nothing, let me handle communications, do not speak to her directly." Nolan followed that instruction with a precision that Renata found over the next several days increasingly unnerving. She knocked on his door on a Saturday morning. He did not answer, though she could see light under the door and hear the low sound of his television. She sent a message through the community app. His attorney replied on his behalf within the hour. She attempted to raise the matter at an emergency board meeting she called for the following Tuesday, only to discover that 2 board members had already contacted their own personal attorneys after receiving the legal notice, and neither was prepared to sit in a room and discuss the association's potential liability without representation present. The board meeting dissolved before it formally began. 3 of the 5 members left without speaking. The 4th, a retired contractor named Gil Ferreira who had served on the board for 6 years and had never liked Renata's particular style of authority, stayed behind and looked at her across the empty conference table. You should have just let the complaints go through the process, he said. I handled those complaints appropriately, she said. You didn't handle them at all. There's no record of any action taken on any of them. Do you know what that looks like to a judge? Renata said nothing. It looks like exactly what it was, Gil said. He picked up his folder and walked out. The day that changed everything arrived not with drama but with a document. Sylvia Okafor had, through the discovery process, obtained the HOA's internal communication records for the prior 30 months. What those records showed was not simply inaction. They showed active suppression. There were 2 emails from Renata to the board's property management company instructing them to mark complaints from specific unit numbers as resolved without action. One email used the phrase, "These residents are difficult." Another described Deshaun Mercer as a frequent filer who did not need to be accommodated. Renata Good had not simply ignored the complaints, she had deliberately buried them. Sylvia called Nolan the afternoon she received the records and read him the relevant passages in a level, unhurried voice. When she finished, there was a pause. Is that enough? Nolan asked. It's more than enough, Sylvia said. It changes the character of the whole thing. We're no longer talking about negligence. We're talking about intentional misconduct by a board officer. That's a different exposure level entirely. What does the HOA do now? They have 2 choices: settle or litigate, and almost certainly lose. Their insurance carrier is already involved. My guess is they settle quickly. Nolan asked what quickly meant. Sylvia said 2 weeks, probably less. It was 9 days. The settlement offer came on a Wednesday and was, in the number that mattered most, exactly $10,000 split between Nolan and Deshaun Mercer, who had been formally added as a second complainant when his prior incidents were incorporated into the claim. The settlement also required the HOA to implement a formal complaint review process that excluded board members from adjudicating complaints in which they had any personal interest, and mandated third-party oversight for all future EV charging disputes. There was one more condition. It had been proposed not by Sylvia but by Gil Ferreira, who had by that point resigned from the board and submitted a formal request that the remaining members consider it as part of any settlement resolution. The condition was that Renata Good resign from the board immediately and be prohibited from seeking a board position for a period of 5 years. The HOA's insurance carrier, eager to close the matter before it attracted further attention, strongly encouraged the board to accept this condition as a demonstration of good faith. Renata signed the resignation letter on a Thursday afternoon. Nolan happened to be in the lobby when she handed it to the property management office. She did not look at him. He did not speak to her. There was nothing left to say that the documents had not already said more precisely. He took the elevator upstairs, set his laptop bag on the kitchen counter, and stood at his window for a moment looking out at the parking structure. Slot C was empty. His car sat connected, charging steadily, the indicator pulsing at a rhythm that was calm and reliable and completely undisturbed. He thought about the cable on the concrete floor. He thought about the 17 minutes he had needed and not gotten. He thought about Petra Voss and Marcus Tran and Deshaun Mercer, all of whom had been dismissed as difficult, as frequent filers, as residents who did not need to be accommodated. He thought about how much quiet damage a person could do when they believed the system was their private instrument. Then he made coffee, opened his laptop, and got back to work. The charger would be full by morning. Part 2 began with a knock on Nolan Price's door at 7:20 on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the settlement check cleared. He was in the middle of his second cup of coffee and had not yet changed out of his running clothes. He opened the door to find a woman he did not recognize, mid-30s, professional, a leather portfolio tucked under her arm, and a direct expression that suggested she had been thinking about what she was going to say for longer than the walk down the hallway. "My name is Camille Ostrowski," she said. "I'm a journalist with the Metropolitan Housing Accountability Project. I cover HOA governance disputes and community association law. I've been looking at your case for about 2 weeks. I'd like to talk to you if you're willing." Nolan looked at her for a moment. "How did you find me?" "The settlement became part of the public record when it was filed with the court. The complaint documents were attached. Your name and unit number were in the filing." She paused. "I should be transparent. I've already spoken with Deshaun Mercer. He suggested I contact you." Nolan stepped back from the door. "Come in." They sat at his kitchen table. Camille opened her portfolio and set a recorder on the table, then looked at him. "Do you mind?" Go ahead. She asked questions the way good interviewers do, not leading, not presumptive, just open doors through which she let him walk. She asked him to describe the morning he found his cable on the floor. She asked what his first instinct had been. She asked at what point he had understood the scope of what he was dealing with. He answered carefully and completely, and when he was done she turned off the recorder and looked at her notes. What you're describing, she said, is not unusual. It's actually part of a pattern I've been documenting across HOA communities in 3 states. Board members in small community associations have an enormous amount of unchecked power and very limited accountability. Most residents don't know their rights, don't know the relevant statutes, and when they encounter resistance they assume the system works against them and stop trying. Renata counted on that, Nolan said. They all do, Camille said. What made your case different is that you kept a record from the first moment, you connected with another affected resident, and you had legal representation that understood the statutory framework. Most people don't have all 3 of those things simultaneously. Most people don't have time to build a case, Nolan said. They have jobs, families, other things. Renata knew that. Camille wrote something. Would you be willing to be identified in the piece? You don't have to be, I can write it with anonymized details. Nolan considered. Yes, use my name. There's something else I want to tell you, Camille said. She paused in a way that suggested the next thing was important. I made some calls about Renata Good specifically. Not for the article, just background. She has a prior history. There was an incident at a property she owned in Scottsdale 5 years ago. She was on the board there too. Different circumstances but a similar pattern: selective enforcement, documentation suppression, a settlement that included a non-disclosure clause. She looked at him steadily. She moved here approximately 18 months after that settlement. The word moved carried weight that neither of them addressed directly. She would have done this indefinitely, Nolan said. Until someone stopped her, yes. Camille Ostrowska's article ran 4 weeks later. It was not a short piece. It was 4,000 words in a publication that, while not large by national standards, was read carefully by property attorneys, community association managers, and housing policy researchers across the region. The headline was measured and factual. The content was not gentle. It traced the full arc of the Cedarwood Point situation, placed it within the broader context of HOA governance failure, and included the specific statutes that residents could invoke when boards failed their fiduciary obligations. It named Renata Good. It named the prior Scottsdale incident, which Camille had confirmed independently through public court records, and which the non-disclosure agreement had covered only in terms of the financial settlement, not the underlying facts of the case. Nolan read the article on a Sunday morning at the same kitchen table where he had sat with Camille. He read it twice. It was accurate and precise, and it did what good accountability journalism does when it is working properly. It made the invisible visible. He sent Camille a text message that said, "You got it right, thank you." She replied with a single word, "Good." The article's reach surprised him. Within 48 hours it had been shared in 14 HOA community forums across California, circulated by 2 tenant rights organizations, and referenced in a brief filed by a housing advocacy group in an unrelated but structurally similar case in Sacramento. A state assembly member's office called the publication to request permission to cite the piece in an upcoming committee hearing on HOA transparency legislation. None of this was Nolan's doing exactly. He had simply told the truth, documented what happened, and refused to accept that the system was someone's private instrument. Everything that followed had been the natural consequence of that refusal. What he had not expected, what arrived as the quieter and more personal conclusion to the whole sequence, was the phone call from Marcus Tran. Marcus had been one of the residents Deshan had mentioned, one of the 2 who had filed complaints and received nothing and eventually left Cedarwood Point. He had found Nolan through Deshan after reading the article. He called on a Wednesday evening and Nolan almost didn't answer because the number was unfamiliar. He picked up on the 4th ring. Marcus Tran's voice was measured and careful in the way of someone who had practiced what they wanted to say. He had left Cedarwood Point in November of the previous year, he explained. He and his wife had purchased an EV, scheduled the charging slot, come down to find it occupied by the same pearl-white Mercedes 3 times in 2 months. After the 3rd complaint with no response, his wife had said she refused to stay in a building where they were being treated as invisible. They had broken their lease, paid a 2-month penalty, lost their security deposit in a dispute, and moved to a rental in a different district that cost them $400 more per month. Reading the article, Marcus said, and then stopped. There was a brief pause. Reading the article was, I want to say frustrating, but that's not the right word. It was painful, because we didn't know we had options. We thought the board was the final word. You did everything right, Nolan said. You filed the complaints, you documented, the board was the problem, not the process. I know that now. Another pause. I called because I wanted to say thank you, not because you did this for us, you didn't know us, but because you didn't stop when it would have been easier to stop. My wife and I talk about that sometimes, the people who don't stop. Nolan was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry it cost you what it did. We're okay now, Marcus said. Better neighborhood, actually, but I wanted you to know there were people on the other side of what you did who felt it. After the call ended, Nolan sat for a long time in the particular silence that follows a conversation that has said what needed to be said. He thought about Marcus Tran's wife, who had refused to stay in a building where they were treated as invisible. He thought about Petra Voss, whom he had never met, about whom he knew only that she had filed a complaint in February and received nothing. He thought about the phrase frequent filer in Renata's email, the dismissive clinical language of someone who had decided that the people filing complaints were the problem rather than the behavior provoking the complaints. He thought about power and how its smallest and most local forms were often its most corrosive, precisely because they operated below the threshold of scrutiny, in parking structures and community listservs and email chains marked internal, in the spaces where people assumed no one was watching. Someone was always watching. That was the thing Renata had failed to calculate. Not necessarily a journalist, not necessarily an attorney, not necessarily anyone with formal authority, just a person who decided that a cable on a concrete floor was not a small matter, just a person who took photographs. The following month, at the first HOA board meeting held under the new governance structure, 3 new members were elected. Deshaun Mercer was one of them. He had not campaigned extensively, he had simply made himself available and let his documentation record speak for his attentiveness. Gil Ferreira, who had resigned but agreed to serve in an interim advisory capacity during the transition, introduced him to the assembled residents as someone who understands that process exists to protect people, not to protect the process. Nolan attended the meeting and sat in the back row. When the agenda reached new business, one of the new board members, a woman named Theodora Park, who lived in Unit 31 and had responded to the original listserv thread with a message about having felt dismissed for 3 years, proposed the installation of a second Level 2 charging station in the parking structure, to be funded from the association's capital improvement reserve. The motion passed with 4 votes in favor, 1 abstention. Nolan drove home from the meeting through a quiet neighborhood at 9:30 in the evening, his car at 83% charge. He pulled into Slot C, his Slot C, reserved in the app, confirmed with a timestamp, and sat for a moment after he cut the engine. He thought about what Sylvia Ackerfer had said the afternoon she described the emails. It changes the character of the whole thing. He had thought she meant legally. He understood now that she had been describing something larger. The character of a thing changes when it is seen clearly, when the frame expands to include all the people it has touched, when the damage that was done in isolation is finally allowed to be understood as a pattern. Renata Good had not believed anyone would take the time to draw the full picture. She had relied on the friction of the process, on the fatigue that accumulates when systems appear indifferent, on the reasonable calculation that most people, after a certain point, simply stop. She had been wrong about Nolan Price. She had been wrong about Deshaun Mercer. She had been wrong in ways she would perhaps never fully account for about Marcus Tran's wife, who had refused to become invisible even if the cost of that refusal was $400 a month and a lease penalty and a move to a neighborhood she hadn't planned on. Refusal had its own cost, so did compliance. Nolan plugged in his cable, his $260 cable which had never been damaged, which he had retrieved from the concrete floor, and coiled back into the trunk of his car on the morning this all began, and walked toward the elevator. Behind him the charger's indicator light came on, steady and green, marking a simple and unambiguous fact. This space was occupied, this connection was legitimate, this transaction had been agreed to in advance by everyone it involved. No one had the right to interrupt it. And now, at last, everyone in the building knew what happened when someone tried.